to this webinar. The reason that many of you join us is we need to keep informing and educating ourselves. And you know that we hold these webinars usually about once a month, so around 10 a year. And we try and choose topics according to maybe there's a special week on. And I'll talk about that in a second. We also listen to what older people have asked us they want more information about, and we choose webinars around those topics. So we've done lots of webinars about health and well-being for older people. We've had an interesting webinar on intimacy and older people. We've had webinars to help older people around driving skills as we all get older. We've had webinars on dying and dying with dignity. We've had ones on the do's and don'ts of downsizing. But our special one today is leading up to NAIDOC Week. And many of you may not know what NAIDOC Week, but it is a time that we acknowledge our First Nations people. And the focus for NAIDOC Week, which starts next week, is around elders. And so we're very, very privileged to have Auntie Norma Ingram with us today. And I'll tell you a little bit about Auntie Norma soon. And we've got Corey with us. Corey's all the way from Broken Hill. Mind you, when I met him before we got started, he had a plane. I thought he was jumping out of the plane, but it was just a terrific background photo. So just a little bit about Auntie Norma. She's a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra originally, and we were chatting this morning about how cold Cowra was compared to where Auntie Norma lives now, which is in Sydney. Auntie Norma is on the board of the Wiradjuri, did I pronounce that correctly, Auntie Norma? Yes, Aboriginal Elders Program in Redfern. And Corey Poulsen is a Wiradjuri man, a South Sea Islander man with European heritage, and manager of First Nations Health, Wellbeing and Service Development at the Royal Doctors Service based in Broken Hill. And we were just chatting before we started. I'm heading out that way in August, so I look forward to meeting Corey actually in person. So the focus of today's webinar is on First Nations Australians and ageing. And we have to ask these questions. What is it like to be a First Nations Australian elder? And Auntie Norma is going to tell us that from personal experience and from all of the people that she supports in her aged care service that she's on the board of. And on Corey's perspective is really important because he's working with elders in his communities, and he knows what it's like to be able to support his people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to improve their health outcomes. And we know, well, I know this, I don't know if you know this out there in Cyberland, but we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live 20 years less than non-Indigenous people. That is a shame on our country. And we know that closing the gap, which you might have heard about in the media or talking with neighbours and friends, we're not really seeing much improvement in all of the issues to do with closing the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, except maybe a little bit in the early childhood area. And Auntie Norma will tell us she's been involved in early childhood as well. Because the question to Auntie Norma is, what is it that you haven't been involved in, Auntie Norma? But we'll explore some of that as we chat. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land that we're on this morning, and I acknowledge, excuse me, I acknowledge connections to the land, sea and community, and Council on the Age in New South Wales, we acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my deep respect to First Nations people who are with us today, especially our guest speakers today. So for those of you who aren't sure, Council on the Ageing, COTA as we say for short, New South Wales, we're based in Sydney, but we try and extend all of our services right across this state. And there is a Council on the Ageing in every state and territory, and there's also Council on the Ageing Australia that's based in Canberra. We are the main peak organisation for people over 50. And when I talk about a peak organisation, what that means is we are a policy and advocacy organisation. We try very, very hard to work with politicians of all persuasions, people who make policy on behalf of older people, service providers, the media, to make sure that these people know what the issues are for older people, but more importantly, we want to make sure that they're acted on. So we do a lot of talking, but we also do what we call a lot of lobbying and advocacy work. We also train and support a network of older people to provide independent information and guidance through a range of programs. We have older men, new ideas, we have community speakers, and we have what we call a new service, pop-up peer information hubs. So just a little bit of housekeeping, folks. Everyone except for Norma, Aunty Norma, Corey, and myself, you can hear us, but we can't hear you because this is a webinar, it's not a meeting, so you are unable to unmute yourself. But what you can do to participate is in the Q&A panel at the bottom. You can ask your own questions at any time by typing into the Q&A panel. You can also do what we call upvote someone else's question. So if they're asking something you'd like to know, or you can answer it if you like as well. So I'll be monitoring those as we go through the morning and try and also choose some of those key questions to ask both Aunty Norma and Corey. One principle with the questions in the Q&A, they have to be respectful. Keep them short. I don't want to see any nonsense in the Q&A and the chat areas. They're there for us to be informed. So make sure that your comments are respectful, and I will choose those and ask Aunty Norma and Corey as we're going through the morning. So as I said, next week is NAIDOC week, and it's a national week that's held right across this nation. I think 2nd to the 9th of July, my memory tells me. And the theme for this year is for our elders. And we'll talk a little bit about what does it mean to be an Aboriginal and Torres Strait elder, but the important information that everyone needs to know that across every generation, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders have played and continue to play an important role, and they hold a very prominent place in their communities and in their families. These people are the cultural knowledge holders. I would like to think that many of them are trailblazers, and the people we have with us today, especially Aunty Norma, when you hear what she's done in her life, if she doesn't mind me saying this, I think she's a trailblazer. Our elders are nurturers. That's really, really important, really care deeply for their people, for their families, for their land, for their sea, for their all of the aspects of nature that is important to them. They're advocates, they're teachers, they're leaders, but the most important thing that I find with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I know, they are survivors. Amazing the things that have happened to them and to their families and their communities. They are still with us, which I think is a miracle in a way. Today we'll explore the impacts of ageing on First Nations Australians, and we'll unpack why is life expectancy and morbidity rates, why are they different for First Nations Australians compared to non-Indigenous Australians, and how culture, community and connection is critical to closing the gap. As I said, I feel very privileged and very fortunate to have both Aunty Norma and Corey with us today. So, Norma, where will I start? Well, I'm not going to read your profile because that will take up the whole webinar, but I'll just pull out a few things that mean a lot to you and also to me. So as I said, Aunty Norma is a Wiradjuri woman from the Cowra area, Cowra in New South Wales. Being the youngest of 11 children growing up on an Aboriginal reserve, she lived under the control of New South Wales State Government's Aboriginal Welfare Act. She'll tell us a little bit about what impact that was on her and also her family. Aunty Norma moved to Sydney when she was young. She enjoyed school and was successful in all her subjects, which then urged her in later years to enrol in Teachers College. Auntie Norma has come a long way since being the first Aboriginal person to graduate from Harvard University in Cambridge in the States, in the USA. There have been many endeavours, adventures and gains in between what she continues to fight for, and that is social justice for all. Auntie Norma, tell us a bit about your story.
Yera Dumarang, Yundu Auntie Norma Ingram, Gale Billa Wiradjuri. So good morning, everybody. That was my language, Wiradjuri. Thank you, Joan, for the introduction. As Joan said, I'm a Wiradjuri woman, Gale River, the Lachlan River, mid-west New South Wales in the Lachlan Valley. And the Aboriginal reserve that we were forced onto was Irambi. And so when I think back about my journey, I guess my life's journey, I don't see it as anything miraculous. Sorry, Joan, thank you for all that beautiful introduction. But it's what I do. My mother was a 5'0" beautiful Wiradjuri woman. That country where I was born is her mother's traditional land. So my grandmother Isabella is a traditional custodian for the Wiradjuri country on the Gale River, and I can trace my ancestry back to one of our warriors, Windradine of the Wiradjuri, who his time was when the tall ships came in, and Captain Arthur Phillips. Many people may know of Pemulwuy in Gadigal country that I now live in. My mother had to come to Sydney when I was quite young, when I was about 11, because she was quite ill. She'd already had, 10 children, and she was very ill. My father was a shearer, so he was away a lot. And so we came down to Sydney because my older siblings had already moved down to Sydney and were working. And so I've been on Gadigal country ever since. I lived in Nambucca Heads for a little while when I was married and my children were young, but mostly I've been in Gadigal country, and I want to acknowledge Gadigal country. I want to acknowledge the over 200 different Aboriginal nations across our country, and certainly acknowledge our Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters and grandparents up in the Torres Strait Islands. So my journey has been, I guess, very active. I've never stopped. I worked up until I was about 16. Sorry, I went to school till I was 16, and then when I left school, I've been working ever since until I retired. I'm a mother of three, a grandmother of two gorgeous, absolutely beautiful two granddaughters, and a great-grandmother of three grandchildren, and they live at Campbelltown. And so my life, I guess, has always been influenced by my parents. My father, as a shearer, always taught us to stand up for himself because he was a member of the union. And he said, you have to stand up for yourself. As an Aboriginal man, when he was away, he was highly respected as a man. When he came back into our town, Cowra, he then again became an Aboriginal under the Welfare Act and was refused even entry onto our Aboriginal reserve. It was another reason why my mother came to Sydney. And so when you look at the history of Aboriginal people and what we've been through, right from when I'd mentioned Pemulwuy fighting against Captain Arthur Phillip in 1770, that fighting for our rights and our justice has continued. There have been so many fights for justice for our people, for social justice, for cultural justice. When I look back, and I can proudly say, for 65,000 years, our people have been, well, that's the Western calculation anyway. But I can say that I belong to the oldest continuous culture on the entire planet that is still there. Wherever you go across Australia, you will still see our Aboriginal culture being practiced. Just talking to Corey earlier about out at Broken Hill and all the sorts of work that we do for our land, our teaching culture. I'm so proud now that in our schools, languages are being revived. They never died, but they're being revived. I, as an Aboriginal elder, had to go and, I guess, learn my language, because we grew up speaking our language on the mission, but it was against the law to do that. So our old people said, you know, we really shouldn't be speaking the language, because if we speak the language and practice our culture, they'll come and take our children away. But we still spoke, and amongst the kids, we still said words. So I was never able to speak my language, Wiradjuri, fluently. But we spoke, we connected, we communicated with particularly young kids. We communicated using Wiradjuri language and English. We did quite well with that. So we're still able to bring that. And so I'm really proud to see that the schools are teaching the younger generation, because I want to acknowledge the next generation as well, because they're our future leaders and our future elders, hopefully. And I keep on saying to our elders, we really need to be talking to our young ones, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. We need to be talking to them about who we are. And sadly, I didn't talk to my mother and my father about them and their life and their you know, thoughts. But we could see how hard my parents fought for our rights, for Aboriginal rights. Indeed, my mother fought. She was part of the fighting in 1938 for Aboriginal citizens' rights. 1967, we had to go and ask the Australian public in the referendum in 67. We had to go to the Australian public and say, please, can you vote yes for us to be counted in the Australian census? And so the Commonwealth government was part of that 67 referendum in taking, I guess, responsibility for Aboriginal people. And it is the same thing now, that we have to go to the Australian population and ask the Australian population to vote again for this year's referendum. We are 3%, we as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are 3% of the Australian population. So I don't care if every Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person in this country voted yes in the Constitution. That's not going to be enough. We have to go to the Australian public. And so this is what we've been doing in my journey as, I guess, I've never called myself an activist, but I guess I am. You know, I was part of, I went to the Foundation for Aboriginal Affairs, where I first met Charles Perkins, who I thought, and I still think, was a man before his time. He went to Sydney University with my children's father. They were the two Aboriginal people at Sydney University at the time. And so Charles was able to gather up support, you know, to go right around New South Wales to those country towns. And so my journey has been all about that, all about learning who I am as an Aboriginal person, as an Aboriginal woman, learning about the history of my people, both culturally and also the fights that we've had to have. And when you think about the stolen generation, where the government was able to forcibly come and take our children, our babies away and rip them out of mum's arms, their mother's arms, it is absolutely devastating. And, you know, the effect of all of that, of all of what we have had to put up as Aboriginal people, still affects us today. We talk about the generational trauma. And so as an Aboriginal elder, and gone through all of those issues and witnessed it or been a part of it, you know, setting up Aboriginal organisations that started in Redfern, like the Aboriginal Medical Service, the Aboriginal Legal Service, and just being a part of that and witnessing the trauma that my people have been through and still continue to go through. When you think about, you know, our young men who were taken away and imprisoned, our young women who were taken away imprisoned, some of our people who were imprisoned and are still there, have been there for a long, long time, for sentences that, you know, that wasn't necessary for them to be there for so long. So I, as an Aboriginal elder, being a part of that, experiencing that and still witnessing that, I know the role that I play in my community. I know that the community does look up to us for support, direction, hugs sometimes, big hugs sometimes. I know the community does that for us. So we do have to be strong. But hey, folks, you know, we have our weak spots too. And when I see a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing today in the media and whatever, that really is quite nasty towards my people, towards us. But folks, it does hurt, but we do have the strength of iron from Mother Earth. We do have the strength of Mother Earth to support us. And we talked earlier about, Joan was saying about why wasn't that Aboriginal man angry? I cannot go through every day of my life being angry. My mother was a great supporter of us being educated, and she said we need to go through the system. So the best way, we talked about earlier, the best way for me as a teacher, as an educator, is to talk to people. I mean, I do a lot of Aboriginal Welcome to Country. I do it in this area. And I give a lot of that information when I do Welcome to Country as an Aboriginal elder. Because I know that there's a lot of people out there who don't know. I know there's a lot of people who come from overseas who may be in that audience who don't know. But we have people out there who vote. And so I constantly try to put in that, you know, educative part of what we do and talk about, you know, we've been here for 65,000 years. We still have our connection with country. You can go anywhere around Australia, as I said, and you can see Aboriginal culture being practiced. Whether it's our people in Redfern Street saying, hello, Auntie, and just acknowledging that's still a strong part of who we are as Aboriginal people. With Aboriginal elders, I kind of liken it to when people go through an education system. You will reach one level. I don't know, it might be a diploma, then you want to go on to the next level. You have to do a whole lot of stuff to get to the next level. You may go on to university. Even at university, there are different levels. You have to go through, but what's happening all the time, if you want to go for a PhD, for example, you will have a small group of people who will be witnessing you and watching you. And then you write down a piece of paper, your thesis, and you give that to this little group of people. And then they'll say to you, we will now call you Dr. So-and-so or Professor So-and-so. In the Aboriginal community, it's the same thing. But you know what? It's a whole community that's witnessing us. A whole community is watching us. And a whole community will say, I've seen what you've done. I respect what you've done. I know who you are. I will now start calling you aunt or uncle with respect. So that's what it's all about, being an elder. And so I can walk up Redfern Street and I get a lot of people, non-Aboriginal people as well, who say, hello, Aunt, how are you? That's respect. That's part of Aboriginal culture. We have a respect. We have a reciprocity in our culture. You know, I do for you, you do for me, and we share. And so I try to explain to people about what eldership is all about. It's conferred on us by the community. I can't say, I don't go into the community and say, you know, I'm a 73-year-old Aboriginal woman, you have to call me auntie because I'm an Aboriginal elder. It doesn't work that way. For me, it doesn't work that way. For so many in our communities, our community will say yes. But then by doing that, by calling us aunt or uncle, that puts a big responsibility back onto us. Yeah, I think as Joan talked about earlier, she said about people looking at us as leaders. And yes, we are. People come to us for information. So the knowledge holders, the cultural knowledge holders, and they say, well, Aunt, what about this? What about that? And, you know, they believe that we have the answers, but we don't always have the answers. But if we do, we will share that. We don't keep that stuff to ourselves. We don't keep all of that culture to ourselves. And I remember one of the old uncles said, in order for me to keep my culture, I have to give it away. And what he meant by that, we have to share the culture, because being 3% of the Australian population, it's no good of us keeping our culture and our cultural information to ourselves, unless it's absolutely necessary to do so. But most information is out there. It's sharing, our art, our songs, our stories, our storylines, our dances. They're to share our culture with the rest of the world, not to keep to ourselves. And that's what Aboriginal culture is all about. It's about giving and sharing. And so I guess with being an Aboriginal elder, I'm really, really aware of the responsibility that I have with that. And I can't, the word we use, I can't gammon. I can't pretend. I either have to know it and share it, or say, look, I don't know. I can try and find out for you, or I just don't know. So I guess, I think the thing is about being an Aboriginal elder is the responsibility, and knowing that our community is going to be coming to us. Our community is going to be asking us information. Our community is going to be asking us to support them because they know the value of Aboriginal elders. They will ask us to support them, and they will ask us for big hugs. I think I said enough, Jo.
You never say enough, Auntie Norma. I could listen to you for hours. But can we just go back, if you don't mind? But you can say
Sure.
no to this. About what are your memories like? What are your memories of living on the reserve? Because a lot of people that are listening to you this morning wouldn't even have a clue about that. But it's up to you. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no. That love to. That's fine. We, before the Aboriginal Welfare Act, there was another act where the government, we were being killed off. Poison flower, poison water holes actually being shot. So the government in England had established these Aboriginal reserves. So that was the government that set up the Aboriginal reserves, and then they sent in the missionaries too to set up mission stations to Christianise the heathen Aboriginal people. And at that time, there was a philosophy of the government had to smooth the dying pillar. So they just assumed the Aboriginal people were going to die out. So they rounded us up and put us onto reserves. And then they brought families together. So we had several different clan groups on those reserves. But in the 1980s, they also had the Aboriginal resettlement program, where they took Aboriginal people from different areas like Broken Hill, put them into Newcastle or Bathurst or down at Albury, so mix them up. And we had a family that was brought out from Walgett that came to our reserve. So whilst we were on the reserve, under the Aboriginal Welfare Act, we were totally controlled by the government, and they put on mission managers. We had to ask permission to go on and off the reserve, even if it was to go into town to do shopping. My mother, as I mentioned, was very ill on several occasions and had to go to Sydney to see the doctor. I remember her telling me this story, and she said, I went to Sydney because I wasn't well. I went to Sydney, but then I came back home to Ramsey, and she said the mission manager looked at me, and she said he was ashen, and he said, Mrs. Ingram, he said, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Sydney. He quite expected her to go to Sydney to die. He didn't expect her to come back. We were totally controlled. We were living on what was called rations of food. So the welfare gave the mission manager money to buy food of rations. So it's usually, we had white bread that was delivered daily. There was a little shop that my mum sent me down to. We had white sugar, black tea, white flour, so we could make damper, golden syrup. So if anybody knows, that's kind of the dregs of sugar. When they do the sugar canes, the golden syrup is left there. So tins of golden syrup. We never ever had butter or margarine. We had dripping, it was called dripping or fat. So we fried the bread in the, so with that diet, could you imagine how that's going to affect generations and generations with their health? So the diet, with the diet, then we had heart disease, kidney failure, diabetes, and so that's all it. But you know, on our reserve, it was so funny. The mission manager used to get, you know, the meat from the sheep or whatever. Oh, my father used to steal a sheep as well, but you know, he's gone now, so he can't be arrested now. But the mission manager used to give us the offals because they thought that was the worst part of the animal. But little did that mission manager know that that was really good for us. So I grew up eating sheep's heart, kidneys, all of those, tripes, and all of those, which was really, I don't ever remember having fruit. Just off the mission was a little quince farm. So we used to go pinch the quinces and eat, we used to eat those raw. I never knew that you could cook them. So we used to eat them raw. So yeah, we weren't allowed to own anything. We weren't allowed to own animals. We weren't allowed, but what the mission manager was also, he gave us some seeds of vegetables. So I remember my mum's father, he had a little garden and he used to grow his own vegetables. But that was, and there was a couple of other men on the mission who grew their own vegetables, but not everybody was able to do that. So that's kind of really what saved us. But it was, if you could think about being in a jail, concentration camp, that's what it was. But having said that, we were there with our family. And so as a kid, we played in the streets because when I was a kid, we didn't have running water or electricity. We had kerosene lamps or candles. That wasn't so long ago, folks. You know, I'm still here to tell the story, so it's not a long time ago. But yeah, we played in the streets. So they had the electric lights in the streets. So we played hopscotch and rounders and all sorts of, so the kids didn't have television or radio in those days, so we played together. So that was really a strong connection for us with our cousins and, you know, extended families. That was a good thing, because I remember when I was at Teachers College, one of my friends said to me, why didn't you just leave and walk off the mission? Why did you stay there? Well, it was the law, for one. But the other one was that when we were there with our families and that strong connection. And quite often we just didn't even know the difference. You know, we went to school. I loved school and school work, but I hated going to the school because I did experience a lot of racism. There was a lot of good friends, but there was a lot of racism there because all my cousins and everything was at school too. And I was just academically, I've got to tell you, the missionaries came up to, and we had a little church. We had a church on the reserve. The missionaries came up, gathered all of the children around. So I learned the Lord's Prayer before I went to school, was able to go to school. I could say the Lord's Prayer. Yeah, verbatim. So we were very influenced by the church, and all sorts of denomination missionaries came to the Aboriginal reserves. So they collected any Aboriginal child that wasn't christened. And if they were Catholic, they would christen them Catholic. If they were Anglican Church of England, they'd christen as Church of England. So in my own family of 11 children, we've got Catholics and we've got Anglicans. I'm Anglican. So we didn't have any Jewish people come up there, although I have so many wonderful Jewish friends now who are Jewish. But yeah, so it's mainly the Catholics and the Anglicans that came to, that did their little tour around the Aboriginal reserves. I think North Coast, there's a lot of Catholics up in the North Coast.
Yeah. And Auntie Norma, what was the housing like on the reserve?
Oh, okay. So for my family, before I was born, my family lived in a humpy, dirt floors. It was just alongside the reserve. And that was mainly because my father was considered as a troublemaker. So they lived in dirt floor humpy. In the 1950s, they moved us onto the reserve, and it was tin huts, absolute tin, corrugated iron tin huts. So 4 walls, and they cut out a square. I was a baby then. They cut out a square for the window and a square for the door. And I remember my older sister Sylvia always saying, in those tin huts, Cowra, Lachlan Valley, on the reserve, even though it was on a hill, it was so hot in summertime and it was so cold in the wintertime. And I remember my sister Sylvia said, I always wanted a glass pane for the window, because what had happened, they had the shutter and they'd have to shut the shutter during the summertime when they had sandstorms. You could just imagine being inside with those sandstorms and the shutter shut. But I would have loved to have had a glass window so I could look out. That was, and then in the mid 1950s, they built the new houses out of fibro. Now, we kids, we used to break that fibro off and play hopscotch with it. We all know what fibro, now we know what fibro is made out of. And we know that it was dangerous, it was poisonous. Yeah, but they built our houses out of fibro and boards and tin huts, corrugated iron roofs. It wasn't much better. They did have 3 bedrooms. Oh, and in those houses, when they were first built, as I said, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have running water. We had to go down to the Lachlan River to get water, and we had either kerosene, if you were lucky enough to have kerosene, or we had candles. The other thing is that out the front, we had the 3 bedrooms and 1 big room for the lounge room and the kitchen and all of that. Well, nobody ever had a lounge room, I don't think. But we had a veranda. At the end of the veranda was the bathroom or the wash house. So we had a copper. We had a wash tub, copper, 2 wash tubs and a copper. So if you were lucky enough to get some fuel like coal or wood to light the copper, that water would be used for you to wash it. Otherwise, you had a shower that was cold water. That water would be used for you to bathe or to do your washing in. So you could boil. We used to boil all of our clothes and sheets and everything. But, no hot water. It was cold shower. So that was our life in the mission. That was some of it.
Some of it. Well, I guess, as you said, you had your family around and lots of cousins, and so that's another way of surviving. And
we had a lot of children who were taken off that Aboriginal reserve too, cousins and off the reserve. So that was a stolen generation. Yeah.
And for people out there that are listening to Auntie Norma, I suggest that you just Google stolen generation, and then you'll get the insights into what happened to some of Auntie Norma's cousins on the reserve, taken away from family, and that intergenerational trauma still sits with a lot of Aboriginal people.
So the policy that the government put up for the stolen generation was to take the children away. That concept of the smoother dying pillow. So they took, there were babies that weren't full-blooded Aboriginal people because there was white men hanging around. So we did have mixture. So they said any child that has white blood, we'll take them away. And there were 3 different homes. One was Bomaderry down Nowra, where they took the babies. So any of the babies were taken there. When they became a certain age, they moved them across to COTA, where all the girls were taken. And they separated all the families, and the boys were taken up to Kinchler, just outside of Kempsey. Brothers and sisters and cousins were all separated. So those children, if they were taken away as babies or they were taken away as younger children, they were kept in those homes till they were 18 years of age. And then the doors were open and they were just told to leave. So there was no education in those systems. They were told that their parents didn't want them. Their parents were, terrible people. They said that my parents were gamblers. Now, the New South Wales state government has the archives that the Aboriginal Welfare kept all records everything of every Aboriginal person on every reserve. And I was able to read my parents' records that they wrote, and they said my parents were gamblers, my father was a drunkard, and all of this stuff. And there was a whole lot of stuff that they wrote. So you read that, and these are the lies that they told to our children. So many of our children did come back to their own reserves, to their own families, and were accepted back, but many didn't make it. You know, many just weren't able to come back. And they set up an organisation called Link Up. I think it's called Link Up.
Yeah.
Which yeah, so Link Up was able to, if you had a child or children that was taken, you could go and you could ask them to do some research for you. If you was one of those children, you could go to Link Up and they would help you find your family. You know, there were some successes. However, there was a lot that weren't successful.
That's right. And people who have died without finding their family. You know,
Yeah.
that's just it's just a wicked thing.
Yeah, or the family had died with the child
right.
came back and
that's right.
Family passed away.
Well, see, Auntie Norma never loses her passion to fight for her people's rights and the recognition of her people's rightful place in our country. So, Auntie Norma, stay with us because we're going to go across to Corey, and we want to talk a little bit about Corey's work. But to introduce Corey Paulson, he's a Wimmera man growing up on the east coast of New South Wales. He has a wife and 4 children. Correct? Yes, a wife and 4 kids. And he's now working in the health sector. Throughout his working life, Corey has worked in regional, rural and remote communities within many industries, mostly in the western and far west of New South Wales, including mining, telecommunications, retail, construction and many social services. Importantly, Corey is a very active member of the Broken Hill community, where he joins us from today, volunteering his time, advising and sharing his knowledge, sitting on many local and state committees. He's currently studying his honours at Charles Sturt University, and he's working with the Royal Flying Doctor Service as a manager of First Nations health and wellbeing and service development. So we're so lucky to have you join us as well, Corey. Over to you to tell us a bit more about your work and importantly your story. And I'd like to have a conversation with both of you about why we haven't closed the gap.
Well, good year, Gabu. Nyata, Corey Paulson, Nyata Waramaguri, Toboruyuri, Marangu. So I just said, yeah, hello, my name's Corey Paulson, and I'm a Toboruyuri boy from the Warramai Nation. And yeah, thanks, Auntie Norma, for that sharing of information. And thanks, Joan, and also Karen for the invitation to come and sit with you, mob, and share some yarns and some stories about me firstly, but also my experiences out here in the far west in the Western New South Wales communities and the work. So I want to start by acknowledging that I sit here on Willakali country of the Barkindji language group, and I've been working out here for 20 years, and it's because of them and their acceptance, as Auntie Norma said. If you're in community, it's about them accepting you and acknowledging you in regards to what you're doing with the First Nations of the town. So I want to acknowledge them, their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all you fellas here too that are in the room and any of the First Nations peoples that are with us. Yeah, so yeah, 4 kids, wife, that's where I always start, but I want to also acknowledge that I was born on Biripi country over there in Taree. And Auntie Norma, your stories of the mission reign true when we think about Perfleet mission. Lots of people know it because it was on the main highway that connected Sydney straight up to Brisbane. And the stories in that intergenerational passing of knowledge, actually, it made me think and remind myself that I was privileged growing up as a young man in my life. My mother's European, as noted. and my father was a worker on the council at the Tari Airport of 26 years, and his father before him, Napier Paulson, Yedika, he's a South Sea Island Aboriginal man from the Bundjalung and Minjabul people, Mununjali people, as a Curry, Nenny Jane. And that privilege was afforded to me in that space of the 80s. And growing up in Tari, a town, yeah, very much on that road up that connected Sydney, Newcastle, Tari, Kempsey, and all the way through to that east coast on the eastern side of the Great Divide. Dad grew up in a quite large family, youngest of 13, and had Pop working at the airport, and that's where I talk about that privileged life, because we were always living in a house. And I understand your yarns about that story of living on the mission with the tin, because whenever we'd go out to Purfleet Mission, that was the experience in the early 80s of me as a young person, was the tin shacks and the humpies that were slowly being transitioned to those, you know, fibro homes, and also homes that weren't meant to be built like that in Australia. I think it's reminiscent for me to listen to your story, Art, because when you spoke, it connected me to my old people's story that I listened to, and then also my grandmother's story from foster mission, growing up out there on top of a Cabaret Ave, they call it, the foster mission, which is right in the middle of town at Foster. And if people don't know, Foster, Tuncurry, the Great Lakes, it's quite a boom town in regards to oysters and the seafood and the industry around that holiday making. And foster mission, when I listen to the stories of my aunties and my father about growing up in foster, your stories aren't connected me back to that assimilation policy that drove the East Coast industry along that situation in Foster and also Taree, and the way that they segregated our children from our parents, and then segregated the parents, you know, men from the women, was in an approach to actually change that process of sharing knowledge from our elders down to our children, and continuing the process of transferring knowledge from in that oldest living connected narrated history in the world. First Nations peoples have survived, and it never died for me. And there have been some languages lost in that process, and there have been some horrific events around, you know, even the early days, like you connected us to that story of Pemaway and Windradine, and there's multiple stories, you know, that connect that East Coast, the heaviest, hardest hit peoples of those many First Nations, and that assimilation within the late 1800s to the early 1900s. I truly believe I'm a product of that assimilation and within mixed relations, but I do believe that I hold the ability to understand the knowledge of my old people and actually communicate that with the sense of cultural responsibility to be soft and to be gentle in bringing along that information education to make sure that people are educated in the right way of education. Our old people, and this is where I'll shift into that sense of I'm wearing my shirt for our elders in regards to our NAIDOC. My old people spoke to me in a way that was gentle and soft. Yet when I heard them speak in the general society to general people, it come with a sense of urgency and a sense of that get up and activism, and there was a sense of it wasn't anger as such, but it was the sense of urgency and meaning, and there probably was some anger in regards to it, but when they spoke to me, I could hear the difference. It was with love, it was with gentle, it was with compassion and understanding and empathy to the plight that I have to undertake as the next generation. And I think listening to Tani Norma speak, I hear the generational shift for eldership is such a wonderful thing within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, because it is the passing of the torch and the slow burn that we see in regards to our plight to get to a standing of equality, self-determination, and also just being able to sit and not have to be validated within Western society. Our knowledge systems are still with us. And when we think of the generations, I definitely come from a generation of, the assimilation, the Western education. I was brought up in a town called Cundletown. We were one of the only Aboriginal families in the white school at Cundletown. And when I think back to my upbringing, the racism that I received from my friends of the time, they didn't know any better. But then to go out to the mission, we were the uptown blacks, we were the coconuts, we were the lamingtons, and that was the in-between, that was that assimilation, that was the product of being a creamy-skinned blackfella and not being from the area, from the mish or from the struggle. And yet now that I tell my story and we talk in this older generation, now I'm in my 40s, and it's only now that they understand that we were actually being oppressed and smashed from a different angle, though it was a different experience. And I think that's a product of what we're talking about today, is Western society's, colonial perspective on what it was in the early days, around that 1901, white Australian policy and the assimilation policy and systems that were designed in regards to how we, as a society, treat Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I really do echo that sense of the church having an influence and an impact on the way that our systems are designed, because I've taken a deep dive into our system, and within my studies, it's come very apparent that when we look around today in the West, far West, I see church institutions that are still established and thriving on the money that's given to them from the government in regards to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's support services. So we've got Uniting, we've got, so that's developed on the Church of Uniting. We've got Catholic Care, sorry, my lights just went out. We've got Catholic Care, we've got institutes that are heavily ingrained and shifted their names away from that. I work for the RFDS, the Royal Flying Doctor Service, founded by Reverend Flynn, another church institute, and connected church institute. I don't say this as a negative or derogatory thing. I think it's just a product of the system that was created back in them days, and now we have to look at how we're implementing reconciliation action plans, how we're moving and shifting to the action side of reconciliation now when we talk about the voice to Parliament. And we see on a international level, we see the influence of the World Health Organization with their policy around, well, it's not a policy, it's actually the act around the rights of Indigenous peoples, the United Nations Declaration, sorry, of the rights of Indigenous peoples, and how that's influencing and shifting the way that our academic system is now starting to establish a process for us to establish what our knowledge system was, and hopefully will be in a place of acceptance, value, rights, and also, no need for the Western system to validate what we know inherently through our kinship systems, our stories, our songs, and all of our practices that go along in our ceremonies. So, yeah, I could talk for days, but we'll, in the interest, let's have a yarn.
Yeah, let's have a yarn. So Corey and Auntie Norma, a lot of people may not know the closing the gap as a sort of a policy of federal governments over time, and they had key targets around a whole range of things to do with early childhood, to do with people living longer, to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and well-being targets. Can you just tell us, from your opinion, we'll start with you, Aunty Norma, about why hasn't that worked? I mean, as I said before we started this, I think there's been a slight improvement in some of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids getting into childcare centres, you know, and being educated from that very early age. I did see some improvement in that, but why hasn't it worked? Why haven't government policies closed the gap?
I really think that government thinks that they have all the answers and they know how to do it, right? They always do for and on behalf of Aboriginal people. I think maybe just recently, you know, closing the gap. And that gap is always for us to be at the same level as mainstream Australian, whether it's health, education or whatever. But I really think they look at the symptoms and not the causes.
Mm-hmm.
And until you can look at why has this happened and why we're still there at this level and not making very much improvement, what's the cause of it? And you have to go back to that history that, you know, Corey and I just talked about. You can't do it without knowing the history of our people and what happened to our people, both on all of those different levels. We've had so many, the journey for us to try and, I think, educate government and government bureaucracy. The journey has been long and arduous. And I don't think they listen, because I think they still think that they know better. And when we as Aboriginal people put it up, and you just have a look at how many Aboriginal people we've got in the public sector, working in the public sector. There's not a lot. And the ones that we do are at very low levels with there. We don't have a lot of people, Aboriginal people, at that high decision-making level.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have somebody that's working in the public sector that's at that bit of a, you know, I don't know, level 12 within the public sector, you know, they're really not decision makers. They still have to go higher and higher. So we don't really have any people, any of our people up there that said, yes, this is the right thing to do. This is the way that we need to do it. And so it will come back to the voice to Parliament. If we get the voice to Parliament in, that we will have people from all across Australia saying, well, the decision that you're making now, Mr. Bureaucrat or Mr. Politician, will not benefit and will not be good for our people. So if you go down that track, it's not going to work. If you go down this track, it'll be much better. Mm-hmm. And so that's that. For me, that's it in a nutshell, that the government thinks that they know it best. They always have. You know, they've always been patronising to us, right from the story that I just told you about I and my family being on the Aboriginal Reserve and what they do. So they're still making the decisions for us and on behalf of us. So many of them are not out there in our communities, living our lifestyle, living our values and all of that. So they're not there. So they don't know. So they will sit in Parliament House or in their big buildings, you know, in downtown, whatever city it is, and they will make these decisions. And I know I worked for the public sector. I worked for the New South Wales public sector, for the Premier's Department. They would never didn't have any Aboriginal people that was above me who were Aboriginal to say, yeah. So we start to rely on the decision of the white person.
Yep.
To say this will. And yeah, look, a lot of money has been spent. And, you know, our politicians will say we spent a lot of money on Aboriginal affairs. Aboriginal people got a lot of money. Wrong. a lot of money has been spent on Aboriginal affairs, but it hasn't gone down. It hasn't got down to the local level where it's needed to, to do those services, to run those services. And why constantly are our people being arrested?
Yep.
Why constantly are our children being taken away and put into institutions? What other alternative can we do than to incarcerate them? And do they listen to the Aboriginal people? I don't think so.
No. And Corey,
It
out your
talks
way, because you are in a very, like what we call remote, and you would be seeing this all the time with, I'm sure, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people whose health and well-being is not crash hot. Tell us your perspective about closing the gap. And folks, we're just going to continue this conversation for a bit longer, but I will plan to finish about 11:45, so another 10 minutes. Yes, Corey.
With the closing the gap, we need to look at the iterations that we've seen. So we've seen different shifts in government, which demonstrates that we've had 4 reports on the closing the gap. So there's 4 terms of government since 2006, 2008. Education is one of the key indicators that we're making a difference in. It's one of the areas that we're making a difference, around Year 12 achievement, and also, so I believe there will be a generational shift in regards to our leadership, eventually once we see that. And when we look at the curriculum change, like only Norma's, influenced and impacted, we're going to see a difference in the generations and future generations to come in regards to that inclusion of First Nations perspectives. I think for me, as a worker out here in Far West, there's an observable difference in the way that they treat regional and rural remote communities. It's like a slow burn when we look at policy and the impact of dollars and cents that they talk about being spent within New South Wales. Let's keep it in New South Wales because we're talking in our state. When we look at that big mountain range, when they look over that mountain range, it sort of stops at Dubbo. They look that far and they go, yep, Dubbo's west, yep, we're sorted. And then all of a sudden we're seeing towns, and let's talk about COVID for a second, towns like Walgett, Bourke, Brewarrina, Wilcannia, and Broken Hill. In that time of COVID, the ACCHO system, when I say ACCHO, the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisations, the Aboriginal Medical Services, they stood up and they did it more advanced and more quicker due to the fact that they knew their community, they knew their people, and what the need was. So they reacted quicker and better on the ground, community-driven, community solution towards the problem and the issue that we're facing as a globe, globally. And when we look at that instance and we connect it to the closing the gap, as a health organisations across that region that receive a disparity in the funding due to the population-driven, population parity of dollars and spread out from government's perspective, we look at, they did it on a smell of an oily rag.
Yeah.
And it even connects to Auntie Norma's stories about how they built those houses back in the day. All of our old people used to be, they looked down upon as scavengers or dump people or dirty people at the dump, but they were making the best of a bad situation using, second tin and seconds of corrugate. And when we bring that into today's perspective of service delivery, most of our regional and remote communities are doing it from, minimal funding with high reporting scales. We're doing it on the back of community drivers. And when I say community drivers, I'm talking about the people on the ground that care the most about their people and have a sense of activism and agency to make a difference. And when I look around at all these communities that we service, from Broken Hill as an epicentre, as Dubbo as an epicentre, Wagga Wagga as an epicentre, all of those communities that just sit around the outskirts that are, 100, 200, 300, and then when we move closer to the Great Divide, you know, they're 15, 20, 50, 70 Ks around surrounding those epicenters. All of that money that they talk about spent on Aboriginal funding goes to Dubbo, goes to Walgett, and then it's disseminated. It goes to Broken Hill and then it's disseminated. So I'm in agreement with voting Norma. It's a systemic problem that we need to look at, and it's the systems that we need to look at through the cause, but then shift it to the solution, because closing the gap actually ensues that there's going to still be a gap once we've done all the work. It's actually shut the gap or remove the gap or not closing the gap, because it only says that we're going to, you know, there's still going to be a gap.
Yeah.
So let's get rid of the gap.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good byline. Let's get rid of the gap. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Because it is in language.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. You know, I've just learned in such a short period of time that we've been together, I've just learned so much. I feel so much shame. And but that's my personal issue. When I start to talk about the shame that I feel, I start to get teary. So I'll I just know that we all have to do a lot more. There was
Joan, on that point though, just before we go on, this is one point that I make sure that most of my non-Indigenous family friends that I talk to about any of these issues is the shame and guilt that you feel is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. It's actually a systems thing. So please be gentle on yourself. And I see the question about being a good ally. This is my biggest plight and my biggest advice for our non-Indigenous people and for our peoples of colour from different, as I've seen Anoop talk about, he identifies from an Indian background, our cultural people that are visiting. Don't feel a sense of obligation towards your old people's happening. Like, that's our forefathers' plight, and on both sides of that story there's conflict. On both sides of that story there's hurt, there's pain. But please don't bring that into your pain and your suffering. So be gentle with yourselves in this space, because we are working towards a difference. We are working towards better positioning for not just us as Aboriginal people, but for Australia, for the population to actually understand better.
I agree with Corey, and I just wanted to add that, again, we are only 3% of the Australian population. There's 97% of everybody else who call themselves Australians or Australian citizens. I'm not at your dinner table. I'm not at your football field. I'm not out playing tennis with you, whatever, but you are. So we have to rely on you, I mean, the rest of Australia, to go tell the true stories, to share that true stories with your family, friends, and whoever you come in contact with, because there's just not enough of us. As Corey says, there's not enough of us to get out there and tell the story. So, and guilt is a useless
yes,
emotion.
So well, that's a lesson I've learned from you. Be kind to myself. Now, what I was going to say, Corey, there was this question there from Emma, and she said 3 things. So you've said one thing, you know, the whole issue about us feeling guilty and shameful about all of the things that have happened to your people. And what Auntie Norma, you just said, you know, get out and tell these stories and share this webinar that we've done today, because everyone out there, you know that this is being recorded and it will be up on COTA New South Wales YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So please share this information with your friends and your neighbours. It's an easy link. So even if you're not IT savvy like myself, pretty easy just to flip a switch and you'll be able to hear Auntie Norma and Corey's presentations again. What else can we do?
If you don't mind, Auntie Norma, I think there's something that sits in between those 2 things. So there's spoken about 2. The first thing is be kind with yourself in this space, and be kind on the people that are sharing. So it's about that understanding that in the communication process, we must understand we're human, and we do get triggered by information. We do get triggered by words. We do get triggered by emotional responses to the information shared. So be kind on yourself. the middle part as a good ally is the education stuff. So just by you guys, Emma, sitting and listening and asking questions, don't ever feel like a question is wrong or stupid or dumb.